March 12, 1943. The morning sun cuts through the haze over the Solomon Islands, but the air is heavy with salt, smoke, and uncertainty. A lone Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber sits on the tarmac of an improvised Allied airfield, its olive-green fuselage gleaming under the tropical sun. The plane should inspire fear, its bombs, its long range, its deadly reputation, but something about it feels fragile. U.S. pilots step closer, boots crunching on gravel and scattered oil stains. They exchange glances, each masked in curiosity and disbelief. Fingers trace the wing's edges, pausing at thin metal panels that ripple under the slightest touch. The fuel tanks, exposed and unarmored, shimmer like glass beneath the sun, completely vulnerable to a single bullet. The smell of oil and fuel mingles with the salty sea breeze. Cockpits are stripped of life, instruments frozen in their last moment of war. The air hums with tension, a quiet question echoing among the men. How can an aircraft so deadly, so capable of striking far behind enemy lines, be built with such glaring weakness? Somewhere beyond the horizon, the faint roar of American engines patrols the skies. The war rages on, but here, in this frozen moment of discovery, men and machines are paused, examining, measuring, understanding. And in that pause, a lesson waits that will change the way air war is fought. Why early 1943, the Pacific theater had become a vast, jagged chessboard of islands, reefs, and shipping lanes. The United States and its allies had moved from defensive operations to slow, grinding offensives, pushing north from Australia and east from the Solomon Islands. Every island captured, every airfield taken, represented a fragile foothold against a determined Japanese defense. The air war was central. Control of the skies meant the ability to supply troops, strike enemy bases, and cripple fleets before they could strike in return. The Mitsubishi G4M, known to Allied forces as the Betty, had emerged as one of Imperial Japan's most formidable long-range bombers. Introduced in 1941, it was designed with speed and operational reach in mind, capable of flying over 2,000 miles fully loaded. Unlike American or British bombers, the Betty sacrificed armor for mobility. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, leaving the aircraft highly vulnerable to incendiary or tracer fire. But this was a calculated risk in Japanese doctrine. The engineers and strategists prioritized offensive capability over defensive survivability. Pilots were expected to rely on speed, maneuvering, and fighter escort rather than armored plating to survive. At the same time, U.S. forces had begun to adapt. Lessons from Midway and Guadalcanal revealed the Betty's strengths and weaknesses. Its long range allowed raids far behind Allied lines, striking airfields, shipping, and supply depots with devastating effect. Yet, reports from downed aircraft consistently noted that the Betty's thin fuselage and unarmored fuel tanks were liabilities. Pilots who survived encounters spoke of aircraft bursting into flames at the first hit, turning once formidable bombers into infernos in the sky. The captured Betty in question had been flown down during an aerial encounter near Bougainville, after being damaged and forced to land on a makeshift Allied airstrip. The aircraft was intact enough to be examined, but each panel, each rivet, each instrument told a story of Japanese strategic priorities. From the cockpit, U.S. pilots noted the compact layout, the dual controls, and the simplicity of the bombing mechanisms. From below, engineers traced the thin wings, the soft metal skin, and the unprotected fuel cells, revealing a plane built for aggression rather than endurance. These insights were more than technical curiosity. The Allies were learning how to exploit a fundamental difference in design philosophy. While American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress relied on armored protection and multiple gun emplacements to survive, the Betty depended on avoidance and calculated risk. Its successes in early campaigns, like the raids over Darwin and the attacks on Allied convoys in the Solomon Islands, had earned it a fearsome reputation. But now, sitting exposed on a patch of gravel and sun, It was clear that the same design choices that enabled long-range strikes also created mortal vulnerabilities. The stakes were immediate. The Pacific War was a contest not just of numbers, but of design, technology, and adaptation. Each captured aircraft offered the Allies a chance to study, to learn, to plan. The Betty's fuel tanks, so glaringly exposed, became a case study in the trade-offs between speed, range, and survivability. For U.S. pilots who had faced this aircraft in combat, the hands-on experience of touching, measuring, and inspecting its structure was both a revelation and a confirmation. They understood, in ways no written report could convey, how these bombers could be destroyed efficiently, how a well-placed burst of machine gun fire or tracer rounds could turn a weapon of terror into an inferno. This moment of analysis did not occur in isolation. Allied intelligence had already been collecting fragments of information from recovered crews, intercepted communications, and aerial reconnaissance. Yet nothing replaced the clarity of seeing the machine with one's own eyes, sitting silently, yet full of lessons. It was a reminder of how war was as much about understanding the enemy's choices as it was about striking them. The Betty bomber, deadly in action, now revealed its secrets under the calm scrutiny of those who had survived its raids. The discoveries made here would ripple across the Pacific campaigns. Pilots and engineers would refine tactics, gunners would adjust target priorities, and squadron leaders would reevaluate engagement strategies. In a war measured by miles, tons of bombs, and fleeting seconds of reaction, knowledge, like the knowledge gleaned from a captured Betty, was as lethal as any weapon. And yet, even as they examined the plane, questions remained. Why had Japanese engineers exposed such critical components? Why risk so much for speed and range? The answers would lie not only in engineering manuals, but in the mindset of a military culture willing to sacrifice individual aircraft for strategic reach, a mindset that U.S. forces were only beginning to understand. For the U.S. pilots who approached the captured Betty bomber, the experience was visceral. Years of dogfights, evasive maneuvers, and near misses against Japanese aircraft had conditioned them to fear this plane, yet to see it on the ground stripped away the haze of battle. Fingers traced the thin metal of the fuselage, noting how easily it dented beneath light pressure. Cockpits were cramped, controls mechanical and unforgiving, demanding constant attention. The human scale of the aircraft became starkly clear. There was little comfort, little protection, and every flight was an exercise in precision and endurance. For the pilots, understanding these conditions deepened their respect for the Japanese crews. Men who flew hundreds of miles over hostile waters, fully aware of the aircraft's vulnerabilities. The Betty was a machine of extremes, capable of delivering death, yet leaving its own operators exposed. Observing it up close transformed abstract threat into tangible reality, anchoring strategy in human experience. Technological angle. From an engineering perspective, the Betty bomber was a study in trade-offs. Designers had prioritized range and speed over defensive armor. Its twin Mitsubishi G4M engines were powerful, allowing it to carry a 1,000 to 1,500 kilogram bomb load across vast distances. Yet the wings and fuselage were built with lightweight materials, lacking redundancy or protective plating. The fuel tanks, located outside armored sections and often partially self-sealing, were highly susceptible to tracer rounds and incendiary bullets, a weakness that U.S. crews had witnessed in combat but could now study directly. Instruments were simple but functional. Altimeters, compasses, and bomb sights revealed an approach focused on efficiency and mission success rather than crew survivability. Mechanics noted the modular construction, ease of assembly, and lightweight framework, all hallmarks of Japanese aviation philosophy. The Betty's technology spoke of deliberate choices: sacrifice armor for operational reach, trust pilot skill over redundancy, and prioritize strategic impact over individual aircraft longevity. Tactical/leadership angle. From a tactical standpoint, the capture highlighted contrasting doctrines. U.S. commanders had invested heavily in armored bombers like the B-17, valuing durability over range. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive reach, daring missions, and rapid strikes against vulnerable targets. The unarmored Betty reflected leadership decisions that accepted high aircraft attrition for strategic gain. Officers studying the plane recognized the implications. Intercept tactics could be optimized, target zones identified, and strike formations adjusted to exploit known vulnerabilities. The aircraft itself became a tactical text, its weaknesses a blueprint for engagement. Leadership, both Japanese and American, will be judged by the ability to read and exploit these designs. For U.S. pilots, the knowledge reshaped risk assessment. What once felt like unavoidable danger could now be approached with calculated precision. Enemy angle. The Betty bomber reflected the Japanese approach to air warfare, a philosophy shaped by geography, strategy, and culture. Japan faced immense logistical challenges across the Pacific's thousands of miles of ocean. Long-range strike capability was essential, and engineers designed the G4M to prioritize that reach above all else. From the enemy's perspective, the unprotected fuel tanks were a calculated risk. Pilots were trained to rely on formation flying, evasive maneuvers, and fighter escort to survive engagements. Losses were expected, almost normalized, in the pursuit of strategic objectives. To Japanese commanders, each aircraft lost was a smaller price compared to the potential disruption of Allied supply lines or destruction of critical installations. The U.S. pilots' shock at the design underscored a cultural and doctrinal divide. American engineers designed for resilience and survivability, while Japanese designers bet on speed, stealth, and audacity. Understanding the enemy's perspective illuminated decisions that had long puzzled Allied aviators, revealing an operational mindset that valued strategic impact over individual safety. Moral/psychological angle. Beyond the technical and tactical lessons, the captured Betty carried a psychological weight. For the U.S. pilots who had faced these bombers, it was a tangible symbol of fear made understandable. The aircraft had been a deadly presence in their airspace, its bomb load and range forcing constant vigilance. Yet, seeing it grounded, vulnerable, and dissected transformed dread into comprehension. There was also a moral reflection. The Japanese design, emphasizing offensive capability over crew protection, revealed the human cost of strategic choices. The pilots, always tempered by somber recognition of the risks faced by the enemy. Each unarmored fuel tank was a reminder that warfare demanded sacrifice, sometimes disproportionately from those who operated the machines. For Allied forces, this knowledge was both empowering and sobering, illustrating the stark calculus of human life within industrialized conflict. Comparative analysis. The Betty's vulnerabilities highlighted contrasts with Allied aircraft design. American bombers, such as the B-17 and B-24, incorporated extensive armor and multiple gun positions, allowing crews to survive attacks that would incinerate a Betty. Structural resilience, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundancy in critical systems reflected a doctrine focused on attrition defense and survivability. The Betty, in contrast, emphasized aggression over endurance. Its long-range capability allowed strikes on distant targets inaccessible to many Allied aircraft, but the cost of pilot safety. This comparison extended beyond machines to strategy. The Allies could afford to replace aircraft at higher rates and relied on coordinated, protected formations, whereas Japanese doctrine demanded daring missions with calculated losses. The captured bomber offered a rare, tactile confirmation of these differences, allowing engineers and pilots to refine tactics, adjust engagement strategies, and better anticipate enemy behavior. Operational insights. Studying the Betty also yielded immediate operational insights. Pilots recognized how to approach interception, which angles to target, and how to exploit structural weaknesses. Anti-aircraft gunners learned to focus on specific zones, most likely to ignite catastrophic damage. Commanders could plan raids with intelligence-informed confidence, leveraging the aircraft vulnerabilities while mitigating Allied losses. Engineers updated field manuals and training programs, ensuring that lessons from a single captured plane influenced thousands of missions across the Pacific. The Betty, once a symbol of unpredictable threat, had become a template for calculated action. The angles, human, technological, tactical, enemy, moral, and comparative, revealed a multifaceted story. This was no longer just an aircraft. It was a lens through which the complexities of war, strategy, and human decision-making could be examined. Every rivet, panel, and instrument informed judgments about the nature of conflict, the priorities of opposing forces, and the delicate balance between risk and reward in wartime aviation. This detailed understanding of the Betty naturally leads into the climax/turning point, the moment when the knowledge gained from this captured aircraft would begin to reshape real-world combat, tactics, and strategy. March 13th, 1943. The sun had barely risen over Bougainville when U.S. pilots and engineers assembled around the captured Betty bomber. The morning air was thick with humidity and anticipation. This was not a battlefield raid, not a dogfight. It was a confrontation with knowledge itself. The enemy plane, so lethal in the skies, now sat silent, yet it radiated the same tension that had terrified crews during combat. The pilots climbed cautiously into the cockpit, gloves brushing against worn control surfaces and polished dials. The layout was familiar yet alien. Dual throttle levers, rudimentary instrumentation, and bomb release mechanisms that demanded both precision and timing. For men accustomed to B-17s and B-25s, the Betty felt stripped to essentials, designed for efficiency over comfort or redundancy. Every observation was cataloged. How far the control surfaces moved, the responsiveness of the rudders, the layout of the gunner positions. Below the wings, engineers traced the contours of the fuselage and examined the unarmored fuel tanks. Thin metal panels stretched taut over the fuel cells, vulnerable to even light machine gun fire. Pilot after pilot recalled previous air battles. P-38s and F-4FS had witnessed Bettys erupt into flames at the first hit. Now, seeing the design in daylight, understanding why these losses were so frequent crystallized in their minds. The analysis was methodical. Bomb racks were examined for load limits. The hydraulic systems checked for redundancy or weaknesses. The engines inspected for accessibility and performance. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of Japanese priorities. The plane had been built to project power across the Pacific, to strike distant targets with minimal support. It was fast, capable, and far-reaching, but it was also fragile, reliant on evasion, escort, and pilot skill. Its vulnerabilities were glaring, and yet they had been masked in the chaos of combat. At the edge of the airfield, a group of U.S. squadron leaders debated tactical implications. If these weaknesses were exploited, Allied fighters could intercept Betty formations with greater confidence. Machine gun bursts aimed at fuel tanks could ignite catastrophic fires, turning a formidable threat into a predictable target. Pilots mentally rehearsed attack runs, approach angles, deflection calculations, and optimal engagement distances. The lessons of hundreds of combat missions converged on this single aircraft, distilled into actionable intelligence. The moment grew tense as a young pilot, recently returned from a mission where his squadron had suffered losses to Betty raids, traced a line along the exposed fuel cells. He shook his head in disbelief. We've been dying for months, thinking they were indestructible, and it was this simple. His tone was not triumphal, but incredulous. The quiet acknowledgement rippled among the men. The gap between perception and reality had just been bridged. Simultaneously, engineers documented structural anomalies that could explain other combat behaviors. Wing flex under load, limited armor around vital sections, and the placement of bomb racks all became clues. These observations would be compiled into field manuals, intelligence bulletins, and pilot briefings. From now on, Allied aircrews would fly with certainty about the Betty's weaknesses, a rare advantage in a theater where much was uncertain and survival depended on both skill and information. This day marked a turning point not because of a dramatic battle, but because knowledge had shifted the balance. The Betty, once a symbol of dread and unpredictability, now revealed its vulnerabilities in plain sight. The U.S. pilot's earlier fear transformed into clarity. Strategy could replace guesswork. Precision could supplant panic. The captured bomber had done what no single air victory could. It had educated, informed, and reshaped the approach to a persistent enemy threat. As the sun climbed higher, a quiet realization settled over the gathered men. The war in the Pacific, fought over islands and skies, was not won solely by bombs or bullets. It was won by understanding, by studying the enemy, interpreting their decisions, and exploiting both technological and tactical truths. In that moment, the captured Betty bomber was more than an aircraft. It was a turning point in thought, strategy, and action. The day ended with pilots and engineers compiling reports, sketching diagrams, and preparing briefings for incoming air units. The lessons learned here would echo across missions from Guadalcanal to the Solomons, shaping attacks, saving lives, and redefining engagements with Japanese long-range bombers. And yet, even as they cataloged every vulnerability, one question lingered quietly among them. How many more planes have they faced? How many more lives have been risked before understanding finally arrived? The clarity gained from the captured Betty set the stage for the second part of the climax, translating knowledge into action, where tactics would meet combat and strategy would be tested in fire, steel, and sky. Climax/turning point, Section 2. Following the analysis at Bougainville, the insights from the captured Betty quickly transformed Allied operational planning. Pilots briefed on the aircraft's vulnerabilities now approached intercept missions with new precision. The unarmored fuel tanks, once a vague hazard, became primary targets. Gunnery instructors revised training exercises, teaching aircrews to aim at critical points that would ignite catastrophic fires. What had previously been a gamble, attacking a fast, long-range bomber, now became a calculated engagement. Field intelligence officers transmitted detailed reports to squadron leaders across the Pacific. Diagrams illustrated fuel tank placement, wing structure, and engine vulnerabilities. Bullet and tracer tests confirmed what the pilots had theorized. A single well-placed burst could set the Betty ablaze. U.S. fighter squadrons adjusted formation tactics, positioning gunners and coordinating attack angles to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk. The lessons extended beyond air-to-air combat. Naval aviators preparing strikes on Japanese supply lines could now anticipate how enemy bombers would perform and how to counter their long-range reach. The first combat missions influenced by this intelligence quickly demonstrated the impact. On March 25th, a mixed squadron of P-38 Lightnings and F-4F Wildcats engaged a formation of Betty bombers approaching Henderson Field. Pilots executed runs specifically targeting the exposed fuel tanks. In minutes, 2 bombers were engulfed in flames, their crews forced to bail out or perish in the inferno. Observers on the ground and in the air noted the stark contrast to previous encounters, where months before Betty formations had broken Allied formations. Now they were decimated before reaching their targets. The intelligence gathered from the single capture bomber had translated directly into operational effectiveness. Engineers and intelligence officers continued refining their understanding. They discovered that variations existed between different production batches of the Betty, some with slightly better tank protection or reinforced fuselages. These nuances were documented and communicated to pilots, ensuring that assumptions would not lead to unnecessary losses. Every observation made at Bougainville fed a broader strategy, exploiting structural vulnerabilities while respecting the aircraft's offensive capabilities. Each mission became both a test of Allied tactics and a validation of the lessons learned from the capture plane. The psychological impact on U.S. pilots was equally significant. Fear of the Betty, once almost instinctual, was now tempered with confidence. Pilots reported feeling a sense of empowerment as they engaged enemy bombers, relying on knowledge rather than luck. Squadron debriefings emphasized not just tactics, but reasoning, understanding why the Betty had been successful, why it had failed, and how Allied forces could leverage both facts. This shift in mindset transformed engagements from reactive firefights into strategic operations. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, remained unaware that one of their long-range bombers had provided the Allies with such profound insight. Every loss to targeted attacks seemed like bad luck, yet behind the scenes, U.S. forces were adjusting, learning, and evolving. The capture at Bougainville became a quiet pivot point in the air war. One aircraft, examined and understood, reshaped outcomes across multiple theaters. By early April, the impact was unmistakable. Allied bombers faced fewer intercept losses during supply runs. Fighter sweeps were more lethal, and Japanese raids were increasingly disrupted. Air combat reports repeatedly referenced tactics derived from the captured Betty. Approach from the side, aim for the exposed fuel tanks, coordinate attacks to maximize destruction, and rely on knowledge over improvisation. The seemingly simple act of studying a grounded enemy bomber had altered the dynamic of Pacific aerial warfare. The climax of this period was not a single battle, but a series of actions informed by one plane. It highlighted the profound truth of wartime innovation. Sometimes victory comes not from superior firepower or numbers, but from understanding, seeing the world as the enemy sees it, identifying weaknesses, and exploiting them with precision. The lessons learned from the Betty bomber were a testament to this principle, a turning point in the ongoing struggle for control of the Pacific skies. The captured aircraft, once a symbol of fear and destruction, had become a teacher, a silent force shaping tactics, saving lives, and redefining aerial strategy. Its legacy would ripple across the Pacific campaigns, influencing every encounter where speed, range, and vulnerability collided in the unforgiving calculus of war. The knowledge gained here naturally flows into the aftermath, where the consequences, operational, technological, and human, are fully revealed. The immediate consequences of capturing and analyzing the Betty bomber reverberated through Allied command in the Pacific. Reports filed from Bougainville were circulated rapidly to squadron leaders, intelligence officers, and operational planners. These documents included detailed sketches, measurements, and tactical notes that transformed abstract knowledge into actionable strategy. For pilots who had faced the bomber in combat, the confirmation of its vulnerabilities offered both relief and empowerment. Where uncertainty had once governed their every engagement, they now possessed certainty, an advantage hard-earned from observation and analysis rather than battle alone. Operationally, this newfound understanding translated into measurable results. Fighter squadrons, primarily P-38 Lightnings and F-4F Wildcats, adjusted attack runs to focus on the exposed fuel tanks and thin fuselage of the Betty. Training exercises reinforced these tactics, emphasizing precise aim, coordination within formations, and timing to minimize exposure. Within weeks, combat reports indicated a marked increase in success rates during interceptions. Pilots who previously viewed Betty formations as unpredictable threats now engaged them with a sense of calculated confidence, exploiting weaknesses that had remained invisible during the chaos of battle. Engineers and mechanics, too, found value in the captured aircraft. Maintenance crews dissected engine compartments, control linkages, and hydraulic systems, seeking insights into both Japanese design philosophy and potential weaknesses that could be exploited during future missions. Notes on fuel cell placement, wing flexibility, and the vulnerabilities of bomb racks were incorporated into field manuals distributed throughout the Pacific theater. These technical insights informed not just combat strategy, but also aircraft design considerations, particularly the development of defensive armaments and targeting systems for Allied fighters. The human cost and psychological impact were also evident. Crews who had previously survived encounters with Betty bombers now had a frame of reference for understanding both enemy behavior and the mechanics of survival. Pilots could mentally rehearse attacks, knowing exactly where to aim and what to avoid. The fear that had accompanied every encounter with a Betty, its sudden appearance over island airfields, its long-range bombing runs, and its apparent resilience, was tempered by knowledge. While combat remained dangerous, the element of unpredictability had been mitigated, giving Allied aviators a critical advantage in both morale and tactical planning. Intelligence reports emphasized that these lessons extended beyond individual engagements. Commanders began to factor the Betty's vulnerabilities into larger operational strategies, including air defense planning for key supply routes and forward airfields. Convoys and troop movements could be better protected with fighter patrols targeting enemy bombers preemptively. By combining aerial reconnaissance, interception tactics, and engineering insights, the Allies achieved a more sophisticated approach to air dominance. The capture of a single Betty became a microcosm of a broader principle. Information could be as lethal as firepower. In a theater defined by vast distances, logistical constraints, and relentless enemy activity, understanding the mechanics, design philosophy, and tactical intent of adversary aircraft became a force multiplier. The lessons derived from Bougainville were disseminated rapidly, influencing squadron-level tactics and contributing to broader operational planning across the Pacific. This phase also illuminated the limitations of Japanese strategic doctrine. The very design choices that made the Betty capable of long-range strikes, its speed, lightweight construction, and minimal defensive armament, also rendered it highly vulnerable. The Allies now had a framework to exploit these weaknesses systematically. Japanese losses increased, and pilots began to recognize a pattern. Aircraft that had once been perceived as nearly invincible could be neutralized with focused, coordinated tactics. The knowledge gained from the capture bomber set the stage for deeper strategic shifts. Allied air planners began incorporating these lessons into future missions, from intercepting bombers en route to strikes against forward bases. It also shaped post-battle analyses and operational recommendations, creating a feedback loop in which intelligence, engineering, and combat experience continuously informed one another. The story of the captured Betty naturally leads to Section 2 of Aftermath, which examines long-term impacts on Pacific air campaigns, Japanese operational adjustments, and the broader consequences of this discovery. Aftermath, Section 2. The broader long-term consequences of the captured Betty bomber extended well beyond Bougainville. As intelligence from the examination spread through Allied command, it influenced strategic planning across the Pacific theater. Squadrons from Guadalcanal to the Northern Solomons adopted new interception protocols, prioritizing exposed fuel tanks and thin fuselage sections in attack runs. The immediate tactical advantage, higher success rates, fewer casualties, and more predictable engagements, translated into a cumulative operational edge. The impact on Japanese operations was indirect but profound. While Imperial commanders were unaware of the Allies' newfound understanding, losses began to mount in ways that revealed a structural vulnerability in their doctrine. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks and lightweight construction, once advantageous for long-range strikes, now became liabilities. Pilots flying across hundreds of miles over ocean and island chains faced higher odds of being intercepted and destroyed. Their missions, designed for reach and speed, increasingly collided with Allied precision, altering the balance in contested airspace. Japanese tactical philosophy, which had emphasized audacity and calculated attrition, was ill-prepared for the systematic exploitation of design flaws. The Allies' approach demonstrated the power of knowledge. Rather than relying on brute force alone, they leveraged information about the enemy's aircraft to increase efficiency and reduce unnecessary risk. Over time, this contributed to a measurable decline in the effectiveness of Japanese long-range bombing campaigns as Betty formations encountered more concentrated, informed resistance. The operational lessons extended beyond air-to-air combat. Naval planners integrated insights from the captured bomber into convoy defense strategies. Knowing the Betty's flight characteristics and vulnerabilities, carrier-based fighters could intercept raids further from Allied positions, reducing exposure to bombs and torpedoes. Intelligence officers adjusted reconnaissance priorities, mapping likely approach vectors, and timing windows based on the aircraft's range and performance. This created a cascading advantage. Once the Allies understood the machine, they could predict its operational behavior across multiple domains: air, sea, and land. The human dimension was equally significant. Pilots who had once faced Betty bombers with dread now approached engagements with analytical precision. Debriefings emphasized targeting, angles of attack, and coordination. Veteran flyers mentored newer crews using the captured aircraft as a case study, translating theoretical vulnerability into actionable knowledge. Survival rates improved, confidence rose, and morale strengthened, demonstrating how a single captured aircraft could reshape not just strategy, but the psychology of combat. Reports from engineers and mechanics highlighted subtle technical lessons as well. Variations in production batches revealed that not all Bettys were identical, and this insight refined operational assumptions. Maintenance crews documented structural weaknesses, fuel system quirks, and cockpit ergonomics, feeding data back into tactical briefings. These technical insights influenced both immediate combat and longer-term aircraft design considerations. Allies began to see a correlation between design philosophy, operational outcomes, and survivability, knowledge that would inform planning far beyond the Pacific War. Finally, the captured Betty symbolized the intersection of technology, strategy, and human cost. The plane had been engineered for reach and lethality at the expense of crew safety, a choice reflecting the values and constraints of Japanese military doctrine. For Allied pilots and planners, understanding this trade-off transformed their perspective. No longer were they contending with an unknowable threat. They were engaging a machine whose limitations could be measured, exploited, and ultimately used to their advantage. By the time the next wave of air campaigns commenced, the influence of that single captured Betty was evident. Tactical doctrines had evolved, engagement strategies had been recalibrated, and Allied pilots approached each mission with the confidence that knowledge, not mere chance, could dictate outcomes. In the grand arc of the Pacific War, this moment of discovery, quiet, analytical, and grounded in observation, served as a turning point, demonstrating the profound impact a single enemy machine could have when its secrets were unveiled and acted upon. The story now moves toward its reflection/closure, where the lessons of the captured Betty are considered in the larger context of human ingenuity, risk, and the philosophy of warfare. The captured Betty bomber on that sun-drenched Bougainville airfield was more than a piece of machinery. It was a teacher, a silent witness to the choices, priorities, and risks of war. In its exposed fuel tanks, thin fuselage, and cramped cockpit, it carried a story of human ingenuity, strategic calculation, and the unforgiving nature of conflict. For U.S. pilots and engineers, touching, measuring, and studying the aircraft transformed fear into understanding and uncertainty into action. Knowledge became a weapon as potent as any bullet or bomb. War, at its core, is the intersection of human skill and technological possibility. The Betty revealed both the brilliance and the peril of Japanese design philosophy. An aircraft capable of striking distant targets with devastating force, yet dependent on evasion, precision, and the courage of its crew. It forced the Allies to adapt, to analyze, and to innovate, not in laboratories far from the front, but in the field under tropical sun and the watchful gaze of history. Each pilot who memorized its vulnerabilities, each engineer who traced its structures, contributed to a chain of understanding that would save lives and reshape the air war over the Pacific. There is a quiet, almost philosophical lesson in this moment. Machines are neutral. They're defined by the choices of those who create and command them. Yet in war, those choices carry consequences far beyond the factory or design office. The Betty's exposed fuel tanks symbolized risk embraced for reach, speed, and strategic effect. For the Allies, exploiting that risk required clarity, courage, and intelligence. History often remembers battles, losses, and victories, but sometimes the pivotal moments are quieter. An aircraft examined, a detail noted, a vulnerability understood. The captured Betty reminds us that knowledge, observation, and the courage to confront complexity are as decisive in war as firepower or numbers. And so, the bomber sits in memory, a fragile machine that once inspired dread, now a lens through which the human mind, strategy, and the unforgiving calculus of combat are revealed. From fear comes understanding. From understanding comes action. And from action, guided by insight, comes the turning of tides in a war that spanned oceans, skies, and the lives of thousands.